Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. This is episode 27, and if this is the first time you're here, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4IS, and this is my co-host, Mr. E. So, Mr. A, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4IS. How are you?
Yeah, I'm going pretty well, and we thought it would be a good idea to do a revolutionary personality. And
Mm,
since
yeah,
you've covered him, thought it would be a good idea to do Che Guevara.
yeah. Very, very interesting man. And quite the iconic revolutionary. I think his image, the one that you see plastered on hipster t-shirts throughout the world, is apparently one of the most famous images of the 20th century.
Hmm.
And yeah, one of the most recognizable images of, yeah, I guess modern times. Although many people I don't say, or I don't think would know too much about the man behind the image, really. I would say that most people probably don't even know who Shay was in terms of what his real name is. It is, everyone knows him as Che Guevara.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't think most people would know that his actual name is Ernesto Guevara. And Che was a nickname that was given to him in his earlier days before the Cuban Revolution when he was traveling, I guess you would say traveling around South America, and taking part in you know, some pretty hardcore activity when he was in Guatemala, actually.
Yeah,
So,
because I guess that's what a lot of people would recognize him for. Like
mm,
everyone knows him as the guerrilla fighter, the tactician, but
mm,
like
mm,
there's a lot about the history about him. Like for
yeah,
example, he was a doctor. I'm sure not many people actually know that.
yeah. And like, if you want to talk about how somebody you know, becomes a revolutionary in all the ways that one could find themselves in that position. Being a doctor was absolutely integral. I'm sure we'll get to that, but being a doctor was integral for his revolutionary beginnings. Yeah, without that, his medicine background, he probably wouldn't have been called upon by Fidel Castro in the first place to join the Cuban Rebellion or the insurrection, as it would have been called at the time. Not so much the revolution at that stage, I would say.
Yeah, and also another aspect, or at least another misconception, is obviously people would understand his history with Cuba, and I think therefore assume that he's Cuban, but no,
Yes,
that's not necessarily the case. He was Argentinian.
yes. Born in Argentina, and I guess there's probably a perception, given the fact that he took part in the Cuban Revolution, and people would describe Cuba as a communist society and living under a communist regime and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of, I guess, people would just assume that Che was working class, but that's not the case either. Che's parents on both sides came from kind of upper class, almost aristocracy, if I can use the word like that. They had, ties to nobility, not just in Spain, but his father had Irish descent. And so they had some claim to some Irish nobility as well. So he was very much, if not in the upper class, the very upper middle class of Argentinian society. And like as a child, he was quite sickly. And so they actually had to move out of the capital city and live in the higher altitudes in Argentina, so he could, I guess, get over the symptoms of his asthma, which was plaguing him and plagued him his whole life. But they were able to, use their position in society to kind of move around and I guess live off the money that they had or the access to resources they had thanks to their station and their position in Argentinian society. So yeah, and that's why Che was a doctor as well. He was, again, he's not from working class background, so he attended university. Um, and, originally he started off studying engineering, actually. And it wasn't until like he saw a bit of kind of the way that things were going in his country and the need for persons in the medical field. But it wasn't until actually the death of his grandmother, I think, which shook him pretty hard. I think she, from recollection, had a similar ailment to him. She also suffered from asthma, or the thing that got her in the end was something asthma related. And
Mm,
so at that point, it shook him pretty hard. And so, the story goes, he became
mm,
a doctor after the death of his grandmother, or chose to study medicine, that is, um, at an Argentinian university, and so forged his path
mm.
from there.
But I guess even before he became a communist, like he did travel around Latin America a number of times,
Yes.
and that kind of
Yeah.
sowed the seeds of his beliefs later in life, and
Mm.
basically leading to his time with Fidel Castro in Cuba.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And
He
then,
spent a bit of time traveling around. Sorry. Yeah.
oh no, all I was going to say is, and in those travels, he saw the inequality and also the
Yeah.
effects of imperialism, and why
Yes.
he basically had to put his hand up.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. I think that he felt from his travels around South America, like you said, noticing the stark inequality, not just between, I guess, classes in Argentina, like, the working class and the upper classes and stuff like that, but like the disparity between, the urban areas and the rural areas, or the how would you say it, the colonial kind of um, heritage or population within Argentina and Latin America versus the indigenous populations. And there were stark differences in terms of, yeah, just their access to resources and access to healthcare and services and all that sort of stuff. And they were kind of, I guess, the indigenous populations in South America that he witnessed were, living in some pretty hard conditions. Even though, they probably knew how to live off the land and survive in certain ways, they still had a lot of their culture torn away from them, and they were kind of, pushed to the side a bit and had to work as laborers and under certain conditions outside of their control. And so he witnessed a lot of this stuff. There's, like, a famous, I think, movie about this. I haven't seen it personally, but it's called the Motorcycle Diaries, I believe, which
Yes.
kind of documents his travels through South America at this point. I'm not sure if it goes through both of them or not, but like when he was studying, he went off at some point and, did a solo trip around parts of South America, and then went off again a second time with a good mate of his, and then like and saw some more of South America. I think more of the northern part of South America. And yeah, like I said, he saw a lot of things, and it, like, kind of, yeah, gave him this passion and this drive to want to see a better South America for South American inhabitants,
Mm.
not for US imperialism. And when I say that, I mean US corporations primarily, because I guess the US foreign policy in South America at the time throughout the 20th century was pretty much, which is you could argue that it still is today, but it was very much um, overthrow, or if a government isn't pro-American corporation and allowing American businesses to come in and take
Mhm.
over and plunder resources and gain control of everything, you overthrow that government with some type of CIA coup, or covert takeover, and you establish a government that will play ball with the Americans. And so he saw that as the main reason for 20th century oppression in South America.
And that obviously leads us to Guatemala and everything that happened with him, like, I guess, with his history, because I
Mm,
guess you kind of touched it, and I was going to touch on it eventually,
mm,
was I guess with Shay's story, it kind of touches on those Noam Chomsky talking points
Oh yeah, yeah.
of the idea of yeah, because South America or Latin America in general is seen as the backyard of U.S. imperialism.
Mm,
If
mm,
there's any like unless you there's a regime that's willing to, I guess, submit to a capitalist country like America and
mhm,
basically submit to U.S. imperialism, like outright,
yeah.
then they're more than willing to overthrow that government and install somebody that is willing to submit to the U.S. And I guess with Guatemala, which is the beginning of Che's revolutionary story, he kind of basically
Mm.
ticks all those Noam Chomsky talking points with manufacturing consent.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a big discussion point through a lot of Chomsky's works, a lot of his written work, a lot of his interviews and discussions and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, Guatemala was particularly important for Shea because at that point he's, finished his medical studies. He's a doctor and he's kind of traveling around South America again. And as a doctor, like, he can pretty much go wherever he wants. It's a very poor place in a lot of the rural areas that he's going to, even the urban areas he's going to in a lot of cases. And so like, he's just being put up wherever he goes. People are like, oh my God, there's a doctor in town. So he gets to go around and do his thing. And he ends up in Guatemala and he establishes quite a friend base there. And he's starting to get at this point um into the kind of political aspect of revolution and I guess the grander geopolitics of South America. And so he ends up kind of working with the Arbenz government um, in Guatemala, which was a left wing government at the time, and so they had an eye for kind of social services and trying to bring things in for the people of Guatemala and maybe keeping the resources that are there and the businesses that are there for the people of Guatemala as opposed to just bending over backwards for the Americans. So like they're still in you know in trade relations with the Americans and all that sort of stuff, but they're not completely playing ball like the way that the US government wants things to be done. And so Arbenz is kind of just seen as this threat to American corporations and yeah, the grand imperial machine. And so, why have to deal with someone who's kind of not fully coming to the table? Just overthrow them. And so like Shay was already pretty annoyed at this point about, American imperialism and stuff like that. And so he was more than happy to be a doctor in the service of the Arbenz government, and, offered his services as a soldier, or like, some type of player in that. And this is the first time he tastes real action because there's like a CIA kind of plot to overthrow the Arbenz government. And Shay is kind of fighting on that side and trying to stop the American-led insurrection from happening. And they fail, and the Arbenz government gets, overthrown, and they're thrown into this. I can't remember what it was, if what embassy he's in, if it's the Argentinian embassy or another embassy or what. But like, they're trapped
Yeah.
in this embassy for a long time, and Shay can't like get out. It's their only safe house in Guatemala.
I think you were right. I think it was the Argentinian embassy.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
And so yeah, he's kind of trapped in there and he has to try and figure out what he's going to do, whether he's going to go home to Argentina or continue his travels and all that sort of stuff. And so he's plotting with a lot of these other kind of left wing people about what to do next. And the big talk in the group is, oh, like Mexico is a pretty radical place, that kind of thing. It's actually Mexico at this point is actually, yeah, this melting pot of like radical left wing kind of, yeah, it's like a hub of left-wing activity, and there's like a lot of people from like all over the left-wing world that are defecting to Mexico and starting up their lives and their movements over there. Mexico at this point, or Mexico City, is just like this amazing hive of left-wing activity. So this is also at the point in Guatemala where he gets his famous nickname, Che,
Yes.
which is like a, I don't know, it's like a colloquial term in like Latin America and a lot of Latin American dialects and stuff like that, which is
Yeah.
Shay is um like translated into English as hey or hey
Mm.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think they said to him things like hey you Argentino, like kind of thing. So they referred to him as the Argentinian and would
Yes.
say hey you. And so it was Shay from then on. And that's where he gets that famous nickname from that everyone knows him for. So yeah, that whole thing happens. He gets a taste for action,
Mm.
that ignites this passion in him. He's probably what in his early 20s at this time,
Mm.
you know. So he's a young man. He's
Mm.
got something to fight for. He's got a reason for being now, um, and he wants to change the world or like change Latin America.
And I guess I didn't know that Mexico City was such a melting pot of
Yeah, yeah, it's apparently a crazy place.
socialism. But
Yeah.
really, that I guess that kind of makes sense because it's not really until the 1980s when I guess your Carlos Slims come into the
Mm,
scenario and everything happens with neoliberalism. So if yeah. So like I guess that kind of makes sense that it would have been a more progressive society, at least at the time that Che was there.
mm,
But I
mm.
guess more important to the Che storyline, he obviously goes to Mexico, and who does he meet? Fidel Castro.
Right, right. Yes, and like the revolutionary figure in the story, gets starts kicking into gear big time. Because Fidel's over there and he's quite the what's the word? Um interesting figure, radical in his own right. I wouldn't say left-wing radical, but he's a radical man because he's got his own kind of desires and his interests. And he is Cuban. He's another
Yeah.
man of middle class kind of background as well, a lawyer by
Mm.
trade, old Fidel. There's a lot of famous kind of revolutionaries who have legal backgrounds, let me tell you that for IS.
Yeah.
And so he's got a passion for not, I wouldn't say he's not got the same passion and zeal that Shay does, kind of rid the rid Latin America of,
Mm.
the evil imperialist US force. He's
Yeah.
just wanting to kind of take Cuba away from the Batista regime, which he does see as just I guess, a right-wing authoritarian regime. He wants to bring in something that's more aligned with the people. So yeah, Shay gets himself to Mexico. I can't remember if he goes there directly from Guatemala or if he stops home in Argentina first before going back.
Mm.
But like he gets himself to Mexico and to Mexico City where he's kind of starting to make relationships with certain people in radical organizations, and making the right connections to with Cubans especially. Some of them which he'd already met in Guatemala, and so he has that connection point and he starts to meet more of them. And then he gets introduced to Fidel Castro, I think, here
Mm.
in Mexico. And it's a very important point because I think Shay doesn't really have a reputation for being this larger than life kind of figure. That's Fidel Castro. Castro. He's
Yeah.
he's that classic charismatic leader, that all those kind of popular movements have. He's
Yes.
like, he's an orator, he can talk, he can inspire, feelings of passion and rage and sympathy and everything within people, just, with a few encouraging words. And so, like, like Shay documents in his letters and all that sort of stuff in his diaries at the time of meeting Fidel, he's just, overwhelmed with such passion. And this is the man that he wants to follow. it's not Che being this like, exactly a leader. Especially at this point,
mm,
he's a kind of a quiet and reserved young man at this point. But this is where in Mexico, where he's really doubling down on Marxist theory. This
mm,
is it. This is where it really starts. He's reading more, it beforehand. He gets his hand on some marks and goes through some stuff, but he talks about it to certain people here and there. But like this is where he starts to. He's going to dinner parties with people. He's sitting in like he's in an apartment with his girlfriend, and they're both just smashing Marx, and they're debating Marxist theory and Marxist analysis of capitalism and imperialism and the socialist revolution and all this type of stuff. They're digesting it and they're going hard at it. And I think this is where he really starts to call himself a communist while he's in Mexico, and he's like kind of dealing with all these different radicals and left wing, kind of this left wing melting pot that's happening around him. Um, and so, like, I think that's a really interesting point that
yeah,
I guess as revolutionaries, we need to be having discussions with people, getting out there, mixing with others, getting ideas, trading ideas,
mm.
and yeah, testing things in a public forum. Um,
Like, see, the thing is, if I were to show a picture of Che Guevara, I think 9 times out of ten, people would like at least recognize him. But I can't say the same for Fidel Castro. So,
mm, mm,
like at least a picture of him. And
mm.
I was just wondering, like, with your personal opinion, like, why do you think Che has kind of stayed the test of time compared to the other revolutionaries that were around
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think Che is iconic of revolution in general, where Fidel is very much tied to Cuba. And because of, I guess you would say, the embargoes on Cuba and how Cuba was literally blacklisted from the global community for 50 years or
him?
something, or longer. Um, Fidel has kind of dropped into the background where Che died young. And like you see this in popular culture, like in music and stuff like that, especially when like someone dies in their prime, like they're kind of immortalized like, in situ right there, and they're remembered
Mm,
as this like early or there's this young genius like Kurt Cobain or someone like that.
mm,
But like if they had continued making music, they might have like lived to see themselves fall into obscurity or something like that. Kind of like what's happened, I guess you're saying with Fidel. Like, he was someone that would have been on everyone's lips in the 60s,
mm,
and like he's kind of fallen into the background because other world affairs have taken precedence and stuff like that. But Che, as like a young man who basically became a martyr for the revolutionary cause of Latin America in particular, has
yeah.
become the symbol of revolution, almost like you know the American kind of like some type of American event, or like Washington became immortalized as the revolutionary face of the American War of Independence, or
Yes.
the rising Napoleon, or the Jacobins, or something like that, became the
Yeah.
face of revolutionary France. And then how Lenin he died kind of early after the Russian Revolution, and he became kind of the face of revolutionary Russia. So
Yes.
while, like we said before, Che's not even Cuban, he's Argentinian. He became the face of Cuban revolution, and so Fidel has kind of just been um, the mainstay and the administrator of Cuban society that followed that. That's just my personal opinion on
No,
that.
no. Actually, you do raise some really good points there, and I guess that's the thing, right? Like, with Che Guevara actually speaking with the revolutionaries in Mexico, and I guess when he um is establishing his friendship with Fidel Castro. Like right after that, that's basically the Cuban Revolution, and that was the thing about the Cuban Revolution, that the government at the time, there was a whole lot of buzz because they knew that um, Fidel, Che Guevara, and the revolutionaries were coming. Even the people knew that they were coming, and there
Yeah,
was a
yeah.
whole buzz about that.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting, isn't it? Like it's kind of
Hmm.
strange how all of that unfolded. Like you think that kind of if you're going to be planning some type of insurrection or a rebellion or something like that, surprises of the essence and like, keeping your plans as close or your cards as close to your chest as possible is paramount to your strategic prowess and your success. But, Fidel's kind of openly talking to, like, I think even the Cuban press at this time and letting the people of Cuba know that he's going to come and liberate them and all this sort of stuff. So the regime that's in power at the time are fully expecting like Fidel Castro to come. Like he even gets arrested in Mexico on suspicion of like trying to rouse an insurrection on Mexican soil. And so like they try and arrest him to kind of I guess not just shut it down, but like he's doing some suspicious activity within Mexico, and they want nothing
Hmm.
to do with it, kind of thing. So they arrest him for a point of time, and they get released. Once they get released, they start to get pretty serious. I think that's when they go um, into like some remote area in Mexico, and they've like hire out this place, or they find this place, and it's their base of operations. That's where they all start training. They get trained by some mercenary, and he teaches them how to be soldiers and they go through a lot of
Hmm.
hardcore training, and this is where Shay kind of makes a name for himself because, you know, they're all Cubans pretty much, and or mostly, and he's the only Argentinian, and he's only really there, like as we discussed before, because Fidel needs a doctor in house, and so he's the medic, and so fulfills a pretty important duty. And Fidel and Shay have a pretty good relationship at this point anyway. So like, he asks him to come along and be a part of this, but Shay develops this reputation at this point for being this very serious, ascetic soldier kind of thing, and like, very disciplined and takes everything very, very seriously. And so he gets I guess, he gets some pretty important a pretty important station within the this kind of Cuban rebellion at that point, and they start training, and then they get the arms that they need, and then they get, I think, the boat that they need to try and make it from Mexico across to Cuba and stuff. And you know, they plan to actually do this invasion and to, go across the waters to enter Cuba. And it's all just like this crazy like mishap. Like some of the people don't make the boat, and so they're left behind, and they don't land where they think they're supposed to land, and like the water's too shallow in certain areas, so they get washed aground, but they're not really on shore, so they have to kind of swim and make their way onto the coastline. And the Batista regime has fully anticipated their arrival, and like I think half of the Cuban force gets wiped out straight away because they get circled, but they're scattered and they're broken apart. So the one half of them just gets absolutely massacred, and the other half kind of survives, but they're scattered all over the place, and they lose their arms and everything. And like they only really survive because I think some locals just gave them a helping hand.
Hmm.
And like this becomes kind of the story of the next, like, so many months and years of this Cuban insurrection that turns into a full-scale revolution. They are relying heavily on the Cuban people to make this work. If it wasn't for the Cuban people giving them housing at certain points and feeding them at certain points, and then just having some sheer luck, like like maybe some wins that they just very with just with absolute luck they were able to overthrow, like small um uh columns and small troops, like groups of Cuban soldiers at the time, and they start to get a bit of a roll on. That's when they start establishing themselves as a force within Cuba. And then they have like actual bases, and they have actual, I guess, planned settlements that they start establishing themselves in Cuba, and like these settlements and these bases that they have are no-go zones for the Cuban regime that's in power, and because they start taking territory and everything like that, then they actually start to get people that come to the cause, and this is a lot of the stuff that Che talks about in some of his work. He writes a guerrilla warfare manual.
Oh
I
yeah.
don't know. Yeah, people. I think if one of his more popular works, but it's just like basically, yeah, a guerrilla warfare guide. Um, and like it's from all of his lessons from the Cuban Revolution, and a lot of it is about getting that popular support from the people and harboring good relations with the people, because in these kind of rural-esque environments, they're the ones that you basically feed the revolution in its infancy, and without the people's support, like they have nothing. So it's very interesting lessons. It's very different from a Russian Revolution slash French Revolution slash American Revolution. They're not like established political parties or established kind of within the status quo that's deciding to take power for themselves. These people, like there's like 20 of them at one point,
Mm.
and from 20 people, they take over a whole country. Like it's absolutely incredible.
I'm very glad you brought up the Russian Revolution, or at least at this stage, it's the Soviet Union,
Yeah, yeah.
because I guess if you roll forward and you know the revolution is successful and um, Fidel Castro's in power. Che's, I guess, the finance minister and the minister of industries, and
Mm, mm.
it's if I'm remembering this correctly, their relations with the Soviet Union. It wasn't Fidel, it was Che.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because, like we were talking about before, Shay, he's an open Marxist, and an
Mm.
open communist. And so Shay makes quite a name for himself, right? As they're going rolling through Cuba and like taking important strategic position after important strategic position and winning over popular support and all this sort of stuff. Like I think the Americans or someone even comes to interview like Fidel and like the revolutionaries and stuff like that while they're in a jungle somewhere hiding in Cuba, waiting to.
Is that the famous interview where he's just smoking a cigar and laughing at whoever's
Yeah,
in.
if it's in the jungle, then yeah,
Yeah,
probably.
yeah,
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 because
yeah.
like people, like, it's a really weird like scenario because like you're watching people are watching from afar and watching them slowly take more and more of Cuba and all this type of stuff. And so Fidel and Shay especially, they have a name for themselves at this point, and especially Shay because like he does some heroic things and like he has this kind of reputation, like we were saying earlier, about being like this stern kind of officer and like high ranking, like basically the offsider of Fidel Castro, while there is other offsiders at this point. But like, yes, as you were saying, because he's well known, but he's also a communist at this point. Well, he's a communist anyway, but at this point, he's known for being a communist. It's really integral because the Russians find out about this, the Soviets find out about this, and once they do take power, it's not any, political prowess of Fidel's or anything like that. It's actually Shay's reputation for being this communist leader in the Cuban Revolution that attracts the Soviets and vice versa. He thinks, hey, let's reach out to the Soviet Union, and like that connection is made, and the rest is history, right? Like the Americans are forever from that point scared of Cuba because it gives the Soviets a strategic foothold in the Americas, and they're able to use that as like kind of a threat, as the Americans would see it, but a deterrent, as the Cubans and Russians would see it, to American aggression.
Yes, because then that leads to, I guess, the major propaganda that was happening around that time of the Cold War, because
Mm.
Like I think it would have been Kennedy at that
Yeah,
stage,
or Kennedy.
and but, the huge panic that the Cubans had missiles, the Cuban had
Yeah,
missiles
yeah,
pointing it straight at America,
yeah.
which really, as a side note, I find that very ironic with the current situation that we find ourselves in Ukraine. But let's put that one to the side.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, like
yeah.
obviously the huge propaganda machine that was happening at the time, that Kennedy and the Americans, the Russians or the Soviets had aligned themselves with a country which was just off their border, and they obviously didn't want they didn't want that to happen.
No, yeah. Yeah, they're
And
terrified, the Americans, by this ideal because, like, they are basically the hegemonic power of the West and the Allies at this point, and they've got no one like that can challenge their authority. Like the Russians, don't get me wrong, are a superpower at this point and all that sort of stuff, but they're on, the other side of the Atlantic slash Pacific Ocean, like depending which way you want to go around, because Russia's so huge. But no one really can challenge American power. But here we have like this little island that's, literally there challenging the Americans, not just at their own game, but like, stopping the spread of American imperialism throughout the Latin American kind of world and and like just, yeah, South American world. Um, but like they're actually threatening them by being friendly with the Russians and allowing them to kind of, yeah, have a way of keeping America in check, because the Americans, like, at this point they've got NATO already, and like they've got all the Europeans at their beck and call, you know like set up along the Russian borders, along, the Great Divide, between East and West Germany and stuff like that. They've got all of their strategic positions there, but nothing is really threatening the Americans, and they just can't have this. And that's why you have the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that. But like, even before all of this, like Shea and Fidel have got a lot of work to do. And as you said, when they finally take power from the Batista regime, which is like this, magnificent kind of story about how they just keep on getting traction and winning over popular support, and by the end, the Batista regime really has nothing. Um, like, it just can't hold its own against this force that's coming, this popular uprising, and when they get into power, and like they kind of, I guess, yeah, overthrow the regime, and like a lot of people flee. Like you have, they constantly call, and Shay would describe them as the bourgeois, of Cuban society. A lot of them just like basically get out of
mm,
Cuba. They see what's going on, and they're like, well, we're out. And they flee to America. I think a lot of them go to the Cuban exiles, go to Florida. I think that's where a lot of them, or somewhere in, the southern states of America, and very close to, um, like kind of Cuba and the rest of South America. A lot of them just get out because like they see what's coming, and they take, their wealth with them, a lot of them, and they get out of the country, leaving, big parts of Cuba high and dry, and without administration, and without the means to kind of, I guess, keep the country going from a governmental, administrative perspective and economic perspective, because a lot of the upper classes just get up and leave. And the ones that choose to stay behind, like, let's not, make it sound all hunky-dory and lovely here. Like Fidel and especially Shay, like they've got a mind to make sure there's no counter-insurrection here, or counter, revolutionary elements going on in Cuba.
mm,
Like one of Shay's first roles, before we get into the finance minister and the minister of industries and all this stuff that you're talking about, one of his major roles is the Cuban purge.
yes.
And he's charged with cleaning up Cuba. And so like they will charge people that are, of the old regime slash, I guess, potential threats to Fidel's regime.
Mm,
They charge them with being enemies of the people. And so there's a lot of people that are rounded up and put to death. We're talking about here.
Yeah.
And there are like media organizations that stay behind, especially right-wing media organizations that are very critical of the Cuban takeover. But at the start, of Fidel's takeover, but like at the start, they're not outlawed. Like they're still allowed to operate as like alternate media companies and organizations and stuff like that. But like eventually, and I'm pretty sure this is Che's influence, it's kind of like writing on the wall here. It's time for you to go. If you're going to keep being like attacking the new regime, like Fidel's regime, then it's time for
Mm.
you to go. If you're going to attack the Cuban revolutionaries. And so they effectively outlaw opposing media organizations or right-wing media organizations that would be critical of Fidel's government.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of brings us to a point that when people use the word, um, I guess, war crimes and atrocities, at least all of that sort of language.
Yeah,
And I would like to make a comparison between that kind of Cuban purge and, say, something that at least is a lot less politically charged as, say, Octavian, who eventually became Augustus in ancient Rome.
yeah,
See, at least if you look at ancient history and you look at ancient Rome, when Octavian was successful, when he took power, and Mark Antony, and I think it was the original triumvirate. Sorry, no, the second triumvirate. Sorry, the first triumvirate is Julius Caesar,
mm,
but Octavian's triumvirate. Now, when he rises into power, he actually has a very similar scenario as probably Che Guevara as well as Fidel Castro, is that he realizes that there are people there of the old regime. So he's kind of a bit like, yeah, either get in line or I'm going to take your estates and uh,
yeah,
but hire a bunch of us, thugs to kill you in the night.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's at least that kind of brings to mind that it's not necessarily that saying that something is right or wrong is missing the point. It's almost as if you have to come to the conclusion of don't hate the player, hate the game.
yeah,
That
right, right.
these kind of regime changes have just kind of happened throughout history. It's
Mm.
just we kind of brush it over with Octavian, who eventually becomes Augustus, but we would be much more prone to saying, "Oh, look at these war crimes
Yeah, yeah,
they committed."
yeah.
Yeah,
And that's what happens for Shea for a lot of it because like kind of Fidel needs to keep Shea out of the limelight at the start of the Cuban takeover because the Americans are kind of like watching it and they're not too sure about what to do. Like they didn't like this whole situation from happening, but at some point, like Fidel and Che, when they're going through and really challenging the Batista regime, like the Americans, they even if they wanted to, at a certain point, they couldn't stop the flow of Fidel. They couldn't stop his like eventual rise and takeover of the Batista regime. They got in too late, basically, or the Americans kind of realized what was going on too late. And so like they kind of were like, well, is Fidel going to be a problem for us? We're not really too sure. But then once they think that he is, it's kind of like I said, it's out of their control and they wouldn't have the means to unless they went in there, actually the American army went in there and like, took control, which they don't like to do. They rarely ever do that. Like we said before, they just get in a puppet to kind of do their work for them.
and plus, I feel like if they were that overt,
Mm.
um, that would that would basically have a Streisand in the sense of what I mean by that is well, the complete opposite. Then people would be like, oh, okay. Well, one, people would be like, well, how authoritarian
Yeah,
are
yeah,
these Americans? And then number two, oh, maybe Che Guevara and Fidel Castro have like their points are right.
yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
yeah. Like it would actually cause the opposite effect of what they would
Yes,
want.
yes. And
And
so like
maybe,
direct American interference is something that might be looked on very poorly by the rest of the world, like, especially the UN. Like this is like pretty much just, well, not just, but like pretty close to World War II, and everyone's supposed to be trying to get along here. The
mm,
Americans aren't supposed to be just directly going in and waging war with people, especially on somebody else's soil without a pretty good bloody justification. And so like, yeah, like I was saying, at that point, the Americans kind of like they don't like Fidel Castro, but like they're trying to figure out whether or not he's going to be an issue for them. And because he's not openly communist, Fidel, at this point, I don't think he's really actually made up his mind about whether he's a communist at this point or not, or openly anyway, let's say. And so Che is instantly recognizable as a communist, as we were talking about before, even before they take power, because it's just associated with his name and the enigma that is Che Guevara. So it's like Fidel kind of has to keep him out to keep the Americans off his back.
yeah,
So like he sidelines Shay, but in sidelining him, he tells him what's going on and says, "I'm going to give you an important task here. You're in charge of the purge. You're
yes.
going to be the one that's going to be out there putting these people on trial for crimes against the people of Cuba, and like you're basically going to have to find these people guilty of these crimes because we need to get rid of them, kind of thing." And so it's Shay that has the blood on his hands for the Cuban purge because he's like kind of heading the trials, and he's the one that's basically putting a lot of these people to death, basically. So Shay's got a lot of blood on his hands, and people are very critical. Like you're talking about war crimes and atrocities. All
Mm,
of Shay's critics will turn to this moment specifically, I think, and say, "Oh yeah, well, look at all the people that he murdered in cold blood." Like all of these kind of leftovers from an old regime that like could be used, especially by the CIA, to lead some type of counter revolutionary movement. But like he's in charge of purging Cuba of them. And like I think he does that quite in typical Shave fashion, like with quite a degree of discipline. And like he just gets the job done, let's be honest.
mm,
And so he does what he needs to do for the revolutionary movement. And so I don't think he ever is apologizing for that, or um, yeah, he knows what needs to be done, basically.
mm,
And so like yeah, when you have these moments where everything's on a knife edge, and people have to make hard choices, he's there doing it. And but like I don't think they really even like all the people that I said that were fleeing like Cuba, like the people from the upper classes and the people that had a lot of interest in things, um, they didn't chase them down and stop them from doing this. So like the writing was on the wall for a lot of people. Get out now, while you still can. And so
mm.
that a lot of people had the opportunity to get out, and a lot of people, like Shay, was trapped in the embassy in Guatemala. A lot of people were going to their embassies looking for asylum and trying to get out of the country as soon as they could. And a lot of people did that. But for those who stuck around, or were too important, you know, they faced like something that was, I think, unavoidable, especially if you're taking a revolutionary movement like this very seriously, which they were. And so, like, we get to the part that we were, touching on before. Shay becomes finance minister. He's like industry kind of leader. Like, we're talking about like all of the upper classes and the administrative classes leaving Cuba and getting up at one point. Cuba becomes kind of like a governmental shell of a nation, a shell of an economy, because everyone kind of just gets up and leaves. And so, like, you know, Fidel and Shay are kind of just standing there with the other revolutionaries with their hands up, going like, well, we're in power now. We have to kind of run this country. And so like they're trying to figure out everything as they're going.
But that's actually where Che Guevara becomes integral, right? Because when he actually becomes the finance minister as well as minister of industries, he's not afraid to get his hands dirty. Like he's out
No,
there
yeah.
with the crops, and if I'm not mistaken, they actually use their relations with the Soviet Union to their advantage because
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, they end up being the sugar the providers of sugar to
Yeah,
the
like
Soviet Union.
there's like, there's a lot of embargoes and
Mm.
a lot of trade restrictions on Cuba and stuff like that. And Cuba is famous for its sugar exports. And so the Russians are like, while the Russians get sugar from, I think we're getting sugar from a few places, like they obviously take on Cuban sugar because Cubans kind of need that trade element to kind of get some stuff out of the Soviets, like weapons, basically, and machinery and stuff like that, like agricultural machinery and industrial machinery to kind of feed their economy. So, like, they start trading whatever they've got with the Russians to try and get things over. And, like, let's be honest, the Russians are more than happy to give them certain things, especially armaments,
Yeah.
to enable them to, like, build up and establish enough of a foothold in Cuba to make sure that they remain in power. And so yeah, like Che is instrumental in this. Like he's an educated man. Like a lot of the other revolutionaries are like, um, just that. They are like soldiers kind of thing. Che and like Fidel are educated. There are other people that are educated in the movement as well, but like, people that are also trustworthy and have been through everything with Fidel. You've got Che, he's educated and like, yeah, he's trustworthy. And so Fidel relies on him like crazily, like, significantly to get things moving in the country administratively. And yeah, uses his intelligence to kind of get the country going. And like, Che famously is, as the Argentinian, is given, honorary Cuban citizenship in this new revolutionary society. Um, and like he's, basically kind of this idol walking around Cuba. But Che is restless. He's not like what we talked about earlier. His real passion is not just ridding Cuba of American imperialism. It's ridding like Latin America, if not the world, of US imperialism and Western capitalism. And so like he's getting itchy feet. He's like you can see that Cuba's coming along. It's kind of established. It's got good ties with the Soviet Union and all that sort of stuff. So it's established, and it's on the right trajectory. Um, and so he wants to start revolution elsewhere. And so like he goes to the Congo at
Mm.
one point. Like a lot of people don't know this, and he tries to get involved in a revolutionary movement over there, which is very interesting. But like the Africans, I think, um, have a very different kind of approach to, I guess, South Americans. In terms of their revolutionary zeal, and it ends up, I think, Che kind of steps into just local kind of what would you call them? Local political battles, as opposed to people that are looking to start some type of working class slash socialist revolution. They're more like looking at, oh, Cuba will send some people over to train us up and help us fight our enemies, as opposed to start, yeah, like I said, like a socialist or a communist kind of society in the Congo. And so like Shay kind of picks up on this, and like any gains that they make gets lost anyway. The people that he's working with, I think he feels aren't really taking the revolution very seriously, and he kind of goes back to Cuba like a long way because he's public enemy number one to the Americans and basically everyone in the West. So it takes him a long time to, I guess, get back to Cuba. And he spends a bit of time like overseas with his missus, actually his wife, and they kind of have the honeymoon that they never were able to have before. And he makes his way back to Cuba eventually, and from there he decides, okay, look, he spends a bit more time in Cuba, and they're all happy to have him back in Cuba and everything. But he wants to start this revolution. He wants to kick it off. And so like his idea with going to the Congo was about starting revolutions in the third world, so Africa, the Asian continents, the South American continents. If you get the third world in on the communist kind of movement, then like the West is just going to fall. Once you're able to kickstart things here, and like this is happening anyway. Like look at Vietnam and China and all that sort of stuff. Indonesia even. like massive communist movements. India's got communist movements and stuff. So it's happening. And like he wants to inspire all of this, but like I don't think he wants to go too far away from home the next time. And so like he decides to go to Bolivia to start a revolution in Bolivia. Um, and so he's able to kind of get in there because it's much closer. And this is where things go really south really fast for Che Guevara, as the story goes.
Yes, because that's the thing about this Bolivian revolution is that, well, it's an aspect of, well, the Bolivians are expecting Che Guevara, but
Yeah,
also they're not going to underestimate him this time. And
that's the thing. Yeah,
also, the other aspect is, well, the USA are not going to underestimate him either. They know what
yeah,
he's about. So, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So like, I think that's a really good point. It's like in Cuba, they kind of sat and watched what was happening. They didn't really take it seriously until it was too late. But like once they get wind of like the Cubans going over to Bolivia, setting up a base somewhere, and like trying to start a kind of guerrilla war to take Bolivia, the Americans and the Bolivians are on that very, very quickly. And they find them out in the mountains. Like, I think I want to say that Shay's a little bit more complacent by this time. Like they've got good resources. Like I said, when they got to Cuba the first time, like there was 20 of them. They probably had a few guns between them, and they really had to work from the ground up to establish everything. When they get to Bolivia, they're well provisioned comparatively. And like, Shay goes off to do some training in the jungles and stuff like that and leaves some people behind a base camp. They do some stupid stuff. And then the Bolivians find out exactly where they are because these guys are just idiots. And so like Shay gets trapped out in the jungle without many provisions because these people have given them away, and all of this stuff just goes really bad. And like I don't know if that's Shay's complacency or just bad luck, who knows. But from then on it's just like him being chased with his closest supporters and soldiers and stuff, them just getting basically chased through the jungles of Bolivia by the Bolivian army kind of thing. And they're
Right.
just being hunted down like game, basically. And like they're on the run for like months and like they haven't got food and provisions and like all this sort of stuff. And they finally capturing him. And he's like a shadow of like the legend Shay, because they're like almost starving at this point. They capture him, um, and they execute him. And like it all comes down to um a series of unfortunate events, I think, in Bolivia, and
Hmm.
being, like I said before, a little bit complacent. But like, there's also political issues as well. Like, they reach out to the Communist Party in Bolivia, and the Communist Party there is kind of a bit like, well, they're actually a political party, and so they've got seats in parliament and stuff like that, and they don't want to be associated with the communists from Cuba because like they hear that Che's coming and they hear other stuff, and they're just like, well, we're our own political entity and we don't want to have to deal with this. And I think they kind of rat them out as well.
Right.
Yeah, because there's a kind of a political rivalry. Well, we're Bolivian communists, not Cuban communists, like kind of thing. And so there's a lot of that sort of stuff. And like, the left is forged on solidarity. And so like, if you're all communists, you've got to see the end game kind of thing, see the forest through the trees. And like they don't do that. And so like I think that they don't get the assistance they needed in Bolivia. And the whole thing falls apart. And, you know, after he's captured, the rest is history. Like the Bolivians take great pride in being the ones that capture Che Guevara, and they put him to death against the wishes of the CIA, may I add.
Yes, because that's the interesting point, right? Because the CIA and the US, they wanted to take him alive.
Yeah. Yeah, well, he's Che Guevara, right? Could you
Yeah.
imagine what they could get from him through interrogation and like understandings of what like the Cubans are doing, what the Soviets are up to, like all that sort of stuff. And so I think at this point, Che is more than happy to be executed by some insignificant Bolivian officer. Um, and then rather than being, taken into the American machine and like, being tortured and interrogated by the CIA.
Mm.
Um, but like that's basically it for him. He kind of fails in his in his Bolivian aspirations, and it's his ultimate undoing.
Well, if there were one one takeaway from his story of one revolutionary takeaway from his story, what would be your your favorite one, or at least
Ooh,
what you think is the most
ooh.
important?
Um, yeah, it's a very good question. I would have to say though, I love the fact that the Cuban Revolution and like Shay's kind of part in that story is one from kind of spontaneity. Che Guevara was like, coincidentally had studied medicine, and he was in Guatemala and then Mexico at the right time and met Fidel Castro at the right time. But like he needed that medical education. He needed to have seen South America to kind of give him that passion for wanting to make a better world. He needed that medical degree to make him attractive enough to Fidel Castro to want to ask him to be part of a Cuban revolution, even though he was obviously not Cuban. And then like they needed to kind of, I guess, have a little bit of luck, but they old saying, you got to be in it to win it kind of thing. Once
Mm.
they got to Cuba, like it's like this kind of this understanding that if you're gonna like, lead a coup or lead a revolution, like you kind of know what you're doing. But that's just not true in this story at all. Like they're kind of like amateurs. They're young men with guns and kind of these grand visions of like of takeover and power and stuff like that. And so they make a lot of mistakes, but like they are in the right situations. And I think as revolutionaries, we need to be doing that. We need to be educating ourselves. We need to be having conversations with other revolutionaries, and we need to put ourselves in situations where opportunities arise, we are able to capitalize on them. And that's what they did. Like they were over there, like when they landed in Cuba, it was an absolute like just schmozzle. They were all over the place. And like I said before, um, from very humble beginnings and almost absolutely chaotic beginnings, they were able to basically take over an entire nation with a couple of guns between them and like no idea what they were doing. They eventually established themselves with because they just had that drive. But like they had to be in it to win it. They had to try and make that leap of faith, but they had to, I guess, have enough means and resourcefulness to just keep going. And so like you don't what I'm really trying to say is you don't have to be perfect to be a revolutionary.
Yes.
You kind of just have to kind of take it as it comes and be willing to learn and learn quickly from the things that are unfolding in front of you. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be this beautiful kind of, you can't train yourself for things that you have absolutely no idea about what is coming next. You can just try and make sure you're as prepared as possible, and give yourself like the best chances when opportunities arise. So just don't think that like things are impossible because the circumstances just don't seem like that. These things, like this kind of Cuban revolutionary story, has come from, like I said, extremely humble and amateuristic beginnings, and they changed the world.
Well, I feel like that's probably a good place, like a good final note to this podcast.
Hmm.
So we might just leave that there. Just as a final few notes for this podcast episode. Again, if you guys haven't heard before, Red Alert 2023, both Myster E and myself are performing on the 6th of May at the Argentine, the Argent Court Hotel,
Mm.
which is in the heart of the city in Sydney. So yeah, we're going to be playing on the night of the 6th of May. So buy your tickets at Surveillance Party, and we'll make sure to get that link for people that want to tune in online. And yeah, the last thing is that synthwave art, and of course, it's the man himself, the myth, the legend, Che Guevara. And the prompt was Che Guevara taking over the world. And as you can see, it's got his very stern, disciplined look.
Yeah, you can see that, and he looks quite, yeah, quite fierce, but also like aged, because you don't get to see an aged Shay, do you? Because
No.
he never really got there. So it's quite, yeah, you can see the lines of determination in that face. He's been through a bit of stuff.
Okay, and with that, guys, remember to keep thinking and keep learning. And to sign us off, I'll give it to you, Mr.
Thank you very much for us, and to all of you out there, please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.